I would like to present an overview of the evolution of the vertebrate skull, especially in the lineage leading to humans. Um, as I do this, there are certainly many different tangents we could run off on and other topics that come into it. And so I have then a separate lecture where I focus primarily on the skull of humans, going through its bones more particularly, say for an anatomy student who intends on applying to med school. So this is going to kind of be an overview focusing on the history of it, and there can be other presentations of the vertebrate skull with different focuses, and I'll have a couple of other lectures later if that's something that you desire. So the first thing we do when we talk about the skull is we split it into two regions. One of the regions protects the brain, and we call that the cranium. So the bones that surround the brain are called the cranial bones. The other bones, which include the bones which hold the teeth, which make up much of the orbit, this is referred to as the face. So if we were to focus on the cranium first, so we'll make the face go away, we see these two bones I'd like to start with. The frontal bone here in blue, we have one single frontal bone as adult humans here in the cranium. And if you were to look at a lateral view, you can see here the blue frontal bone, and in green, there's a pair of parietal bones, which then meet in the midline here. So where did these bones come from? Well, none of these bones are found in the first fish, like the jawless fish or the cartilaginous fish. Even once the jawed fish had bones in their dermatocranium, we don't recognize frontal and parietal bones. However, we do recognize them in osteichthyans. So if you were to look at it, say, a bowfin alive today, which is an osteichthyan fish, it has a parietal bone here, so a very large component of the skull. If you were to look at a salamander, and there are different kinds of salamander, and their skulls, have lost and modified different bones, but you can see both the frontal and the parietal bones. So these bones are not unique to humans. They're found in other animals. Although, given the hundreds of millions of years in the evolution of these bones, they can change. So for example, in frogs, they have actually fused the two bones together and have what's known as a frontoparietal bone, where the two frontal bones and the parietal bones are fused. So here's a turtle. It not only has frontal bones, but parietal bones. So these bones are then typical in the vertebrate cranium, the frontal and the parietal bones. If we were to, so here you can see in a cat as well. So these bones which we find in humans are not unique to humans. But clearly there are differences when we compare those human bones to others. So the differences include that when these began in fish, they are simply flat plates. So there are no frontal or parietal bones in the very first vertebrates, which had, essentially a splanchno-cranium, and then the later ones which had the chondrocranium. But by then the time you get to the osteichthyans, which instead of these big bony plates have these little bones, we see certainly a parietal bones in the first osteichthyans. The frontal bone, kind of tougher to say, and the reason is, my understanding is when you look at the fossils we have of these early fish, they aren't necessarily all complete. Some are missing the snout region, but then also you just have a lot of thin, flat bones. And saying that one is definitely homologous to the frontal bone, might be difficult. So we know that the parietal bone is present in the first bony fishes such as Saurolepis. The frontal bone might be among the little bony plates in the area, or they might have originated later. As time goes on, the amphibians have the first frontal bones that we can, be sure of. They get larger over time. But both these and the parietal bones are still just flat plates. They don't surround the orbit. They don't have a sinus the way that they do in mammals. At first, there is a joint between the parietals and the bone behind it called the post-parietals, but that will get lost as we get into the tetrapod, so there's no movement, no joint there. By the time we get to the first reptiles, the frontal and parietal bones are getting bigger. The brain is getting bigger that they are helping to protect. The frontal bone is now making up part of the orbit. It had not done that prior. The parietal bones of amniotes also then become larger. By the time we start getting into the mammal-like reptiles, you will notice a slope developing. So the skull roof is no longer as flat as it was. It starts to become more rounded. And in mammals, the brain is getting larger, more bulbous, and these frontal and parietal bones are becoming rounder to enclose a larger brain. As I will discuss earlier, there had been an opening between the parietal bones for light to come in. So when we study the brain, there was a pineal organ, which was, quote, a third eye, not an eye for vision, all right? So no early vertebrate was like looking up and say, ooh, look, you know, there's something over my head. It's not like for that. But light was coming in a hole between the parietal bones, and this light was helping to train the biological rhythms, you know, when it was day, when it was night, how long the seasons were, etc. And so that's typical of the early fish, of the early amphibians, even the early, you know, reptiles and mammal-like reptiles, that there's a hole between the parietal bones for light to come in and help the brain and train these circadian rhythms. That is lost in these mammal-like reptiles. Now, another thing that will happen, and I'll pick up on this in just a minute, is that there were other small bones incorporated in the skull. As in general, when we go from the reptiles to the mammals, the number of skull bones is reduced. So you'll see there's bones like a prefrontal in front of the frontal, a post-frontal, a post-orbital, post-frontal, post-orbital bone. So there's all these little bones around the eye. These then are lost. So reptiles have more bones around the eye than the mammals do. And I'll get back to that in just a second. Mammals kept enlarging their brain gradually over time. And so the parietal and frontal bones got bigger as the brain got bigger, not only in mammals, but now also then in placental mammals, and then also then in primates, and then in higher primates, in apes. The brain kept expanding. And obviously this then this involved the frontal and parietal bones, because as you can see here, there's no way you could get a larger expanded brain unless the frontal and parietal bones were then expanded as well. Now, I'd like to pick up on two topics there, but first, if you were to look at the skull bones of, you know, say an alligator and a turtle, you would still see some of those bones which were lost, like a prefrontal and a post-orbital bone. So these are still part of, you know, these were part of the ancestral skulls, and reptiles just have more bones in their head than the mammals do. And mammals, some have fused, and then others have been lost. Now, before going into the next bone, just a couple of side topics here. First was the ancestors of mammals had bones completely encircling the eye. So they had what was called a post-orbital bar. Remember, though, there was little bones like the prefrontal, the post-orbital, etc. So look here, this is a mammal-like reptile, a cynodont. And notice, here's a bone that other mammals have lost. So the mammals would lose this one and lose this one. But notice, before it was lost, the eye is completely surrounded by bone, and there's a separation between the eye and where the jaw muscles go. So there's a post-orbital bar. So this is a cynodont reptile, an ancestor of mammals. But the late cynodonts and thus then the early mammals would lose these little bones, and so thus they would lose a post-orbital bar, and they would then lack bony protection around the eye. Now, that probably wasn't a good idea, but for tens of millions of years, mammals were essentially little nocturnal rodent-like animals. So they weren't really relying on vision. They didn't really have big, well-developed eyes. These eyes apparently didn't need that much protection. The first mammals then did not have a separation between where the eye was and where the jaw muscles were. And if you look at a lot of mammals today, so for example, here's the head of an armadillo. This is where its eye would be. This is where its jaw muscles would be. And note, there is no post-orbital bar that would separate the two. It's just one big space. That is typical in mammals. And if you were to look at most mammals, that's actually what you would see. So the same thing here in this mastodon. If you were to ask, where's the eye? Here. Where's the jaw muscles? Here. But note, there's no post-orbital bar separating them. So here's a funny story. When primitive, humans going up to a couple hundred years ago, even in colonial America, were digging up elephant heads of, fossil elephants, which had traveled the world, like mammoths and mastodons. They didn't understand that. And so when they saw one big opening here, they just assumed that's where the jaw muscles went, not knowing that that's where the eye was. And because these are elephants, they have two fused openings for their nostrils here at the base of the trunk. But people found this and found one really big hole here, and they said, this must be the head of a giant human. And this must be a cyclops. That must be, an opening for one big central eye. There must have been these giant cyclops people running around. And it wasn't. It's an elephant head, and they just didn't appreciate that the eye was here, and this was the base of a trunk. And so when we look at a lot of mammals, they do not have what's called a post-orbital bar. Now, clearly, protecting the eye is important, especially as mammals became more and more diurnal, as coming out in the day became more and more important. So here, if you look at a cat, notice here's the frontal bone. Here is a cheekbone known as the jugal or zygomatic bone. And notice that they almost touch, but not quite. So they don't have a complete bony post-orbital bar protecting the eye, but they certainly have bony protection around the eye. So the first mammals lacked it. Many mammals today lack it, but some mammals are trying to get it back, all right, slowly. And here you can see in cats, they're almost there, okay? So they almost have a post-orbital bar. There are, you can see they almost touch, the frontal bone almost touches here. Now, there are some mammals which did get it back. So here's an ancestor of primates. Once again, it has a bump on the frontal bone, starting to give a little more protection to the eye. This is what's known as a plesiadapiform, but it does not have a post-orbital bar. So camels evolved a post-orbital bar and got this feature back. So did horses. And so did primates. In fact, this is one of the defining features of primates. That skull that I just showed you is not a true primate. It's a relative of primates. But here, when you look at this lemur, this New World monkey, this tarsier, notice that the eye is surrounded by bone. That's one of the defining features of the primates compared to their original ancestors. So a couple of mammalian groups get the post-orbital bar back. Camels, horses, and primates would be examples of that. And because I'm talking about the frontal bone, a part of the post-orbital bar is the frontal bone coming down and touching the zygomatic bone in the cheek region. One last comment. So this affects the parietal and frontal bones, but would also affect occipital and temporal. Obviously, I had mentioned that these bones kept getting bigger and bigger as the brain did. So reptiles have bigger brains than amphibians. Mammals have bigger brains than reptiles. Primates have bigger brains than non-primates. Apes have bigger brains than monkeys, etc. And as we look at, say a chimp brain with its cranial volume coming in this region of 400 to 500 cubic centimeters Cs. As we look at, well, what makes us human? Obviously, a big brain is part of that. The big brain, however, it came later. So if we were to look at the Australopithecines, their cranial volume is really, well, kind of midway in with chimps at first. And so our hominin ancestors were adapting to upright walking before they were enlarging their brain. But by the time we get into some of the robust Australopithecines, they actually had a cranial volume, some within chimp range, but when you look at Boisier, it actually is a little bit bigger than a chimp range. One of the interesting things about these hominids is they depended so much on chewing that they actually had a ridge on their parietal bones to attach larger chewing muscles. But when you look at Australopithecus boisier, notice its cranial volume is just a little bit higher than that of chimps. And also notice that it has a ridge on its parietal bone for enlarged chewing muscles. One of the things we see definitely by Homo habilis, which is one of the reasons this species has the name Homo, is the brain case is expanded, right? So when we ask who belongs in our genus of Homo, an enlarged frontal and parietal bone, in addition to the occipital and temporal regions as well, there's just an expansion here, making a rounder brain. And in a large brain, notice that the brain volume is outside the range of chimps. And so if we're asking, what significant happened in the history of these bones, the frontal and parietal bones and their expansion to form an enlarged brain, that was clearly important. Now, once various species of Homo existed, one of the things you might notice about them is, in general, they did not have this. See this forehead? This is a new thing in the genus Homo. So when you look at most members of the genus Homo, the skull is low but long. All right, so notice there's no forehead there, no forehead there, no forehead there. So the frontal bone does not rise immediately here, and very often there are these prominent brow ridges. So the skull, even as it was getting bigger, it had a different shape than humans, than modern humans. So two things are going on. These bones are not just changing their shape, becoming more, or changing their size, so becoming more rounder, allowing for a larger brain. As we look at Homo erectus, the earliest members of Homo erectus have smaller brains, which are smaller than modern human range. So look at the earliest members of Homo erectus. Small brains, they're smaller than modern. But by the time we get to late Homo erectus, the brain size is within the range of modern humans. And so the size is increasing, but then also the shape is increasing. You can tell the difference between Homo sapiens and these more primitive humans like Homo erectus, because the more primitive species had a more prominent brow ridge. Our brows are nowhere near as significant, but also notice we have this forehead. Our skull is shorter, but more highly rounded, more highly domed, as opposed to Homo erectus, where the skull is low but long. All right, and so as we look at the history of the frontal and parietal bones, not only were they significant in vertebrate history, but also obviously as we consider human evolution, our brain size and the shape of our skull are clearly important there. Okay. So the next bone, still in the cranium, these are the bones which surround the skull that I would like to talk about, is the occipital bone. Now, humans have one single occipital bone, but as I had mentioned in the previous lecture, the ancestral condition in fish, amphibians, and reptiles is to have lots of little bones. Some of these are bones of the dermatocranium. Up here, some of these are bones of the chondrocranium. But what happened gradually in the evolution of vertebrates, and what we can actually observe in human embryos, is that all of these little pieces gradually fuse together to form one single occipital bone. And so the early fish had cartilage in the occipital region, although they did have a foramen magnum which surrounded the point where the spinal cord entered into the skull. From the chondrocranium, there were components which would ultimately form part of the occipital bone. There was dermal bone of the dermatocranium, etc. And as we get to the vertebrates on land, there was a bump on the occipital bone known as the occipital condyle, where the skull met the vertebral column. Also, the notochord, which in fish and even in some of the earliest amphibians could actually penetrate the skull, that no longer happened. So the notochord was now kept outside the skull. By the time we get to reptiles, some of these bones, like up here, the tabulars and post-parietals, are getting smaller. The supraoccipital gets bigger. And then as we look at the reptiles leading to mammals and then ultimately to primates, these then fuse. Now, this fusion was only partially complete by the time of the first mammals. And so if you were to say compare, say a human skull to that of, say, a cow, you would see that, the elements have fused together in different ways. So yes, they have fused, but because the fusion happened after the mammal lineages had already started to diverge. For example, some of the supraoccipital of humans has not fused to the basal part. It's in cows compared to humans. And then the same is true of the temporal bone, where while humans have one temporal bone, which is really complicated because it forms part of the zygomatic arch, it has bumps which support muscles like the mastoid process to support the sternocleidomastoid muscle, the styloid process which supports the ligaments of the tongue, but also then surrounds the ear. So it also has holes for blood vessels for the brain. So it's a really complicated bone. And as I had mentioned before, it's a composite bone which starts off as lots of little pieces which gradually fused, some from the dermatocranium, chondrocranium, and even splanchnocrinium. And when we look at, say, frogs or fish, you could see these as separate components. So we humans, we don't have a squamosal bone. The squamosal is part of the temporal bone, all right? But here you can see that instead of having the squamosal and petrosal being two parts of the temporal bone, here in a frog, they are two separate bones. So in mammals, these would fuse with the middle ear between them. The quadrate, as I will get to, is one of the bones which gets incorporated into the middle ear. But in reptiles and amphibians, it's actually part of the jaw joint. All right, so here, the quadrate and the articular, these are bones of the jaw. So when a turtle opens and closes its mouth, the articular of the lower jaw is rubbing against the quadrate of the upper jaw. In mammals, the quadrate and articular become ear bones, and the lower jaw articulates with the temporal bone. So it's a temporomandibular jaw joint, a TMJ. So notice here, cats have a temporal bone, where in more primitive animals you would have seen separate pieces of the temporal bone. Once again, this happened over tens of millions of years, the gradual fusion of these elements, as I outline here. And so there are components of the temporal bone which originate in the from the splanchno-cranium, like the styloid process, and those ear bones, the chondrocranium, which forms the petrosal part of the temporal bone, and then the dermatocranium. And thus, you know, as we go from the amniotes into the synapsid reptiles, these changes are occurring, and the areas fusing together. And also then we're getting a change in the jaw joint, which I will get to soon. And so by the time we get to the synapsid reptiles, also you have a zygomatic arch around the temporal opening. But I should, speak to that directly. So you may recall that as we look at reptiles, at some point we realized that we would like to classify them into separate groups. And one of the ways that we can do that is the first reptiles did not have what we see here, holes in the temporal region for jaw muscles, so that muscles which attach to the lower jaw can actually, you know, go through this hole and attach up here, so they become longer. And longer is better when it comes to muscles in the sense, because it's like a lever. All right, so the, you know, if you know your physics, you know, the longer the lever, the greater the force you have on one end when you push down on the other end. So if we can make these muscles longer because they can go through this hole and attach to the skull surface, that means that, you know, there's more power when they close the jaws. The very first reptiles were anapsids. They lacked these holes, and so the jaw muscles attaching to the lower jaws, they weren't very long, and so therefore that would have limited the bite force that their jaws had. Now, most reptiles are what are called diapsids. They have two holes in the temporal region, an upper temporal opening and a lower temporal opening. The first reptiles were anapsids without those openings. But of interest to us is the group of reptiles which developed one opening here, which is called the synapsid opening. And so the first reptiles had no openings, but here's a reptile from the late Carboniferous going into the Permian, which has one single opening known as a synapsid opening. Now, lots of early reptiles had that synapsid opening, but today the only animals which do are the mammals. So the mammals evolved from synapsid reptiles, which have this one single opening. So here it is in pink, and so here's the human skull in two different orientations. So there's a opening which is made by the fusion of the temporal bone to a cheekbone known as the zygomatic bone, forming the zygomatic arch. The zygomatic arch, composed of the temporal and zygomatic bones, then encloses this synapsid opening, so that now the jaw muscles, which I have attaching to the lower jaw, they don't have to stop here. If they stopped here, they would be rather short and I would have a fairly weak bite. They can go through that synapsid opening and attach here. If you remember, some of those Australopithecines had a ridge up here, so jaw muscles could, be even longer. These longer jaw muscles allow for a more powerful bite. So that is one significant, thing about, the temporal bone, the development of these openings here. One other comment. I'm going to be getting to the. Actually, forgive me. I was going to go to the lower jaw and the face. Why don't I end with that? So those were some of the major bones. Just a couple of other points. The cranium then includes the frontal and parietal bones, the occipital and temporal bones, and then finally the sphenoid and ethmoid bones. They're a little harder to find and identify because you'd say have to rip off the face in order to get a complete look at them. So there's the ethmoid, there's the sphenoid. Notice that the face would cover them for the most part. The sphenoid is once again a great example of a composite bone which forms from lots of separate components. And thus, when we look at the skulls of more primitive vertebrates, like a salamander, here you might see a pterygoid. What is a pterygoid? Well, the human sphenoid bone has a pterygoid process. So the pterygoid is a separate bone in some of these more primitive animals, and it forms part of our composite bone. And once again, interestingly, so we're getting parts of the splanchno-cranium, chondrocranium, and dermatocranium as well, forming the sphenoid bone, and then the ethmoid bone coming from the chondrocranium. And so these are complex bones, which then change a bit over time. The sphenoid area is changed in its overall shape. Now, one of the things I intend on focusing more, say with the respiratory center, but just very quickly, who cares? Well, here's just a thought. If you were to say, what makes me a human different from the non-human animals? Clearly, we have a lot of the same bones. One of the big ones is speech, right? We speak, non-humans don't. That's one of the big human things. It would be hard to imagine human civilization unfolding as it did if we did not have speech. Why don't primates like gorillas and chimps speak? Why don't they? Well, the answer is their brain allows for speech, at least sign language. All right, so that's like human language, a form of communication, but they can't do oral speech because they can't make the right sounds. They can't make the repertoire of sounds which human speech utilizes. Why? Well, it's the hyoid bone's position and also the sphenoid's size and shape, in part because in those other primates, the jaws stick forward a little bit further. Our ancestors changed the position of the hyoid and then flattened the face, which changed the sphenoidal section of the pharynx. And this then, there were some downsides. We choke on our food a little easier. And also we need braces often, I certainly did, because we have the same amount of teeth, but we don't have as much space for them. But by changing this area's shape, it now allows us to make the repertoire of sounds which we use in human speech. So to a large extent, we are what our skulls have allowed us to be. Here would be another example of that. Notice the position of this opening in the occipital bone. This is the foramen magnum, where the spinal cord enters the skull and expands to become the brain. And notice its position here in this Australopithecine, just right directly underneath the skull. And then notice the same thing here in this Australopithecine. But then in contrast, look at its position in these apes, this gorilla and this chimp. So it's only an inch or two difference, but the opening in the gorilla and the chimp, instead of rising, allowing the spinal cord to be directly underneath the skull, it's coming in at an angle. That forces these other apes to use their hands to support them. So they are quadrupedal because they use their arms in locomotion because their spine is entering the skull at an angle. Whereas when you look at humans or in these Australopithecines, the foramen magnum is directly underneath the skull. And this is what they then use for upright locomotion. So once again, that's just a difference of, say, an inch or so. But its migration then was a major component, a major factor in the hominins developing upright walking. Okay. And so the same thing as I wrap up the skull just on the bones of the face. As these the bones of the dermatocranium developed in osteichthyans, there were bones above the nostrils, the nasal bones, and we still have these, making the bridge of our nose. There were and notice they can change their size based on how long, say, a snout was, as you saw in that alligator. There were bones which developed on the medial side of the orbit, known as the lacrimal bones. So we have lacrimal bones that have a tear duct, and so too do other animals, going back to the bony fish. One of the things in the mammals and the primates was the lacrimal became reduced, and ultimately then in primates was limited to the orbit, so it no longer reached the tip of the snout. The jugal bone is the name we use for this bone if it's not composing part of that post-orbital bar. So the jugal in, say, a fish or a more primitive vertebrate is homologous to the zygomatic because once this bone forms a process to touch the frontal bone, then together the frontal bone and the zygomatic bone form a post-orbital bar that then completely surrounds the eye. So we call it a zygomatic bone because our zygomatic bone or cheekbone touches the frontal bone to form that post-orbital bar. As adult humans, all of our teeth are held in a facial bone known as the maxilla. But it should be noted that when we were fetuses, our incisors were held in a premaxilla. So if you were to look at a fish, they not only have, like this bowfin, it not only has a maxilla in red, but it will also then have a premaxilla in front of it holding some of the teeth. And in humans, we develop both a maxilla and a premaxilla, but in our fetal development, the premaxilla fuses to the maxilla, so that in adult humans, all of our teeth are held in only the maxillary bones. But once again, here you can see that a premaxilla was the ancestral vertebrate condition going back to fish, and so that you can see that the teeth in the incisor region are held by a premaxilla, and it wasn't until we look at the ancestors of humans that the premaxilla and the maxilla were fused. And so, in addition to the bones which surround the brain, which we call the cranium, there are then the bones of the face, which then compose the upper and lower jaws, surround the nose, make up part of the orbit, etc. And we can observe gradual changes in these bones as well. So for example, when we discuss the respiratory system, we'll mention the internal nares, which allowed these fish and the ancestors of amphibians to breathe through their noses, where air coming in here could keep on going back straight. I'll explain that later. There was lots of fusion. So for example, the vomer, which makes up part of our nasal septum, started off as a pair of bones, which then fused. In reptiles, there were teeth in the roof of the mouth, the teeth of the palate. These were lost in ancestral mammals. Once again, one of the things I certainly find interesting is how small changes in skull bones made such a big difference in the evolution of vertebrates, particularly that lineage leading to mammals and ourselves. So if you look at the internal nostril of this frog, notice that it goes into the oral cavity. So there's really not much of a nose versus a mouth. And so frogs, they either have to breathe or eat through this one opening that they have, because they can't do both if they just have one space. They really don't have much of a nose. They don't have a nasal cavity. Same here with this turtle. The nostrils are emptying into the mouth. But the problem then would be for mammals, if they wanted to be warm-blooded, how could you possibly get enough oxygen to maintain a warm-blooded metabolism and a big brain? How could you eat enough food if you only had one opening and you constantly had to choose between eating and breathing? So what mammals evolved is that bones fused in the roof of the mouth, the maxillary bone and a small bone called the palatine bone. And this then created what's known as a hard palate, which separated that space into two, so that there is a mouth and then there is a nose. And so as a result, mammals can breathe constantly, even when their mouth is full. And this then allows them to get the oxygen, which maintains that high metabolism. So here you can see the maxillary bones and the palatine bones, which then fuse to make this hard palate, which then was a major point in allowing the larger brains and the higher metabolism of mammals. So once again, the skull bones, they're not just giving, the shape of the head, they're also affecting the size of the brain, affecting bipedal posture and allowing for warm-bloodedness. Look, these cows are chewing all day. If they had to stop breathing in order to chew, well, then they couldn't reach their large sizes, their warm-blooded metabolism, etc. So these bones which came together, the maxilla and the palatine bones which came together to form the hard palate, this was significant in the evolution of mammals. I had already mentioned the lower jaw, so I'd like to just focus on that just for a second. A lot of my students think that the lower jaw is relatively boring, and to be perfectly honest, I must admit, if you're just thinking of the human lower jaw, it's just one bone. All right, so there's just one bone called the mandible, and this bone then forms the jaw joint with the temporal bone. So the TMJ, the temporomandibular joint, is where the temporal bone articulates with the mandible, and it holds all of the teeth of the lower jaw. But the history of the lower jaw is far more interesting. When you go back to fish, amphibians, and reptiles, they had lots of bones in the lower jaw. And what happened over time is that this mandible, which in the next animation is colored blue, this mandible will slowly get bigger and bigger. But notice here in this alligator, there's lots of bones in the lower jaw, not just the dentary bone, which composes the mandible. I'm sorry, the dentary bone. So here you can see in blue, the dentary bone, which makes up our lower jaw, the mandible. But in the ancestral condition, notice that there's all of these other little bones here. Now, I'd like you to watch this pink one, the angular. Something exciting is going to happen there. And also, if you ask, how would a fish, a reptile, or an amphibian open and close its jaws. Well, there is no TMJ. This mandible made of the dentary bone does not articulate with the temporal bone. Instead, it is an articulation between the quadrate and the articular. And you may remember seeing the quadrate bone as a separate bone in things like the frog and the salamander. So the quadrate in yellow and the articular in red, they articulate to allow the jaw to open and close. But as fish evolved into tetrapods, which evolved into reptiles, the quadrate and the articular got smaller and smaller. The dentary got bigger and bigger with, this big area for a muscle attachment. The angular even developed, this little hook to it. And so by the time you were getting to the synapsid reptiles, the ancestors of mammals, the lower jaw was looking different. The outside had lost most of the little bones, and it was just pretty much the big blue dentary which was left. And on the inside, the medial side, a lot of these little bones formed a rod-like structure, but it was still the this blue dentary, which was the major bone. Now, interestingly, there comes a point with the mammal-like reptiles being almost mammals, where if you ask, where does the lower jaw touch the upper jaw? The answer is now in two places. The red bone of the lower jaw touches the yellow bone of the upper jaw, here at a quadrate articular joint. That's the reptilian jaw joint that's on its way out and is being reduced. But you also now get a new jaw joint, a temporomandibular joint, where the blue dentary touches the temporal bone. So right in this area, all right, you had two jaw joints developing, the new mammalian one on its way in and the old reptilian one on its way out. By the time you get to the first mammals now, this transition is either complete or virtually complete, so that the lower jaw in mammals is just one single bone, this dentary. And it's the dentary which now contacts the temporal bone to make a temporomandibular joint. What happens with these little bones then? Well, interestingly, if you look at a human fetus and a mammalian fetus, they still form, all right? So the bones are still there. But instead of forming part of the jaw joint, what happens is they migrate into a space forming as the different parts of the temporal bone come together. So if you look here, the temporal bone has a hole in it between the squamosal and petrosal pieces. Once again, they were one separate bones. So here you have a hole, and in the hole, you have these little bones called auditory ossicles, which allow us to hear better. Reptiles don't hear very well at all, but mammals do, because you have these three little bones, the malleus, incus, and stapes. Reptiles have a stapes, but mammals have then added the malleus and incus. Where do they come from? These are the yellow and red quadrate and articular bones from the jaw joint, which have now moved and become middle ear bones. So mammals changed their jaw joint and then took these two little reptilian jaw joint bones and then incorporated them into the ear. Now, you may remember that the pink bone in the animation, the angular, was developing a hook in it. That bone then becomes part of the skull and supports the eardrum. So here you can see the angular is going to support the eardrum. And then inside here, you can see that ring of the angular, but then also notice you've got those auditory ossicles. Notice how close you are to the jaw. These are all forming in the jaw region, but then this pink bone, the angular supports the eardrum, and then the quadrate and articular, then they become the malleus and incus. And so these auditory ossicles are considered skull bones, but they are neither part of the cranium or the face. They are separate. And then the last bone, which is also separate, is that hyoid bone. The hyoid bone hangs from ligaments from the styloid process of the temporal bone. It's around the larynx. It supports some muscles from the tongue. And once again, it fuses because of multiple elements from those pharyngeal arches. So even though it's just this little U-shaped bone, it actually has a complex embryonic history as those different units form. Now, once again, it's important for speech. It hangs from the styloid process of the temporal bone. Once again, that's the part of the temple from the splanchno-cranium. And one of the interesting things is, once again, if you ask, how is it that humans have speech, whereas gorillas and chimps don't? Well, one notice that the position of the larynx and hyoid bone have dropped in human ancestors. While that's a problem, it makes it easier for us to choke on our food. Nevertheless, it was important in human speech. And so one of the focuses I've had in this is, while, it's wonderful to study the human skull, because it's so obviously important to us. It has the same bones as we find in the skulls of other vertebrates. And the history of changing ancestral elements of the vertebrate skull to get to the human skull, it's a fascinating story.